The program on the television was a documentary history of the Vietnam War. As she painstakingly piled wrapping paper and squeezed Scotch tape into a sticky ball, Calliope watched soundless scenes of stock footage, helicopters whooshing over rice paddies, straw huts buckling under a deluge of napalm, young soldiers in foxholes, their faces smeared with camouflage and the unmistakable mix of terror and exhilaration. One immediately wonders what possible interest such a program could hold for a young child. In an early interview with the poet Donald Hall, Calliope suggested that she had, quote, always been fascinated with combat, that place where the architecture of death becomes most apparent, where it is distorted into an artificial binary, you or me. She went on opening her gifts, perhaps thumbing through the gold-edged pages of the Blake volume or quietly strumming Robert Johnson's guitar, in her mind hearing one of terrible children's hit songs, her father's forlorn and vulnerable voice as real to her now as it had been in her infancy. There were no sounds from upstairs, only the quiet buzz of the Christmas tree, the merest drift of music from the cul-de-sac. It was nearly dawn. It would have been then that Antonio, Skip Cardenas, then an ambitious intern for the LA Weekly, having crawled on his belly through the shrubbery, arrived outside the living room window and took out his camera. She was sitting cross-legged at the base of the tree, he recalls, all the presents around her. She looked just like any other kid. It was hard to believe this was the one, sprung from the skull, like everyone said. Calliope would have had no inkling she was being observed. For 3 years she had not set foot beyond the property, had had no contact with humans other than her mother and the staff. She would not have understood the lengths to which desperate people go to get close to their desires, the terrible lengths to which emptiness and grief can drive us. She could not have understood rapaciousness. What we know is this. At some point, Calliope looked up from the gifts in her lap, and the scene on the TV had changed. Soldiers and refugees had been replaced by a long line of people, a slow procession through the streets of Saigon. It was not a parade. There were no spectators yet, as the file of robed men and women, all with shaved heads, made their way into a busy intersection, a crowded car crawling behind them. The people milling about on the sidewalks, wheeling past on bicycles and scooters, the vendors in the covered market, and the one uniformed policeman directing traffic all glanced up with expressions of only slight curiosity, even annoyance. It was wartime, after all, and they all had, as W.H. Auden famously put it, somewhere to get to. Calliope immediately recognized the marchers as Buddhist monks and nuns. Even at age 7, she had more than a passing familiarity with Buddhist monks. After her father's hurried funeral, they had filled the house for weeks, gliding about in whispers of saffron, burning incense, strewing flower petals, lining the hallways with their prostrate chanting forms, and standing watch outside her mother's door. Although in the confusion, Calliope had come to believe they were called Bootish monks, so named, she assumed, for the dark, leathery smoothness of their polished heads. It is also conceivable that she would even then have been aware of the well-traveled rumor which placed her father's remains in a sealed room in the Mount Baldy Zen Center outside Los Angeles, though it would be some years before she would begin her quest to recover them. Perhaps it was this recognition that caused her to put down the Blake she'd been browsing and turn her attention to what was unfolding on the television. When the procession arrived at the middle of the intersection, the line of monks divided, turned in opposite directions, and moved out toward the street corners, doubling back until the perimeter was filled. As the last of the marchers entered the intersection, the car was permitted to pass inside the circle, where it came to a halt. Several monks got out, all but one moving to the rear, where they opened the trunk and took out several large jerry cans. The last monk moved solemnly to the middle of the intersection and sat with legs folded in the lotus position. Behind him, the monks and nuns had begun to chant. Calliope watched their lips moving in unison, though she still had not turned on the television's sound. Bystanders had gathered outside the circle, craning their necks, and the police officer struggled to break through the line of monks who stood shoulder to shoulder and refused to let him pass. "Bootish," Calliope said aloud, her small voice ringing up into the rafters, the balcony at the top of the stairs. Her hands were folded, her face without expression. Bootish, flutish, rootish, brutish. She may even have surprised herself, her voice unheard since the morning of the suicide. Certainly she surprised Skip Cardenas, who moved closer to the window when he saw the child rise to her feet. As the crowd in the Saigon intersection deepened, their attention fixing on the seated monk, Calliope's litany continued. Suitish, crudish, lutish, prudish. The seated monk's lips moved slowly, and in his left hand he gently manipulated a string of prayer beads. The monks surrounding the intersection, shoulders high, continued their silent chant. The nuns clasped their hands and held them beneath their chins, tears streaking their cheeks. None looked away. Nudish, she said, her voice louder and steadier. Trudish, foodish, Judish. The monks standing by the car approached the seated monk. One by one they emptied the contents of the jerry cans over his head, soaking his robes, spreading a dark pool over the pavement. As Calliope looked closer, she recognized something in the monk's serene, distant expression. And in that moment something kindled inside her, a small flame that would never be extinguished, that in time would grow to an inferno. The police officer fought valiantly to break the circle, angrily shoving his way between two monks, his face contorted with urgency. The seated monk's expression did not change as he produced a small box from beneath his robe, took a breath, and lit a match. The television screen exploded with soundless light, flaring more brightly than the Christmas tree, more brightly than the light crawling over the horizon, reflecting in the window panes and in the wide, almost ecstatic eyes of the young girl as the monk's body was slowly swallowed by flame. "Burning," Calliope shouted, "burning!" Her voice shrill enough that Skip Cardenas heard it through the glass, distraught enough to break through the ayahuasca haze and awaken Penelope and the Inca shaman. "Turning, yearning, learning," she shouted, and the black and white image on the screen danced and roiled, liquid flame and dark smoke filling the picture to every corner. "For a minute I couldn't even look," Cardenas recalls. "It was just this intense light, I could see it through my eyelids. Then I could see her again, standing in the middle of the room, wearing her father's sunglasses and this wild look on her face. I thought all that light was coming from her. I thought she was glowing." On the television, the flames took shape again, organizing around the monk's body, the onlookers just dim shadows in the background. "Fire," said the young poet. "Fire!" And this was when Penelope and the shaman sprang from the bed and sprinted down the upstairs hallway, she in a satin robe with a fur collar that billowed open behind her, he wearing only a necklace of human teeth, both emerging at the top of the stairs to stare down from the balcony in terror. "Wire, dire, gyre, pyre," cried the child, raising her arms above her head like some tiny otherworldly priestess, pixels of light dazzling from the rhinestone sunglasses. The monk's form was now visible amid the flames, which leapt up and up from his lap, over his chest and shoulders, caressing the top of his head with preternatural fingertips. Calliope could see his hands folded, his palms turned upward in a posture of deep meditation, such that the flames seemed to be pouring upward from those hands, to be produced by those hands, as if the fire consuming his life were the product of his own body, the expression of his desire grown uncontrollable, doubling back and devouring itself. "Fire, sire, liar," Calliope shouted, her words clearly audible now to Skip Cardenas, to Penelope and her spiritual advisor frozen on the balcony, watching the girl in the grip of the strange, awful fever. And though both Cardenas and Penelope insist this was not the case, we simply must assume that Calliope in her rapture stepped close enough to the tree that her nightgown touched some overheated ornament or worn length of wire, because to believe the version that her mother has told for the last 14 years is to subscribe to a kind of mythology that this author hopes studiously to avoid. For in the next second, it appeared to the three bystanders that the fire on the television, that ghostly, silent articulation of the monk's soul, had somehow leapt from the screen and ignited the air around Calliope. The child who had for so long been a shadow, a walking absence, continued to shout her first and most inspired poem, "Sire, liar," over what was suddenly a roar of sound, while the monk's body slowly darkened, shrinking slowly to a charred coal at the core of a fountain of flame. And the crowd wept and chanted and prayed, the policeman only now managing to force his way past the monks, only now, when there was nothing left to accomplish, standing dumbly a few meters from the vicious heat of the body, staring dumbly and then absently, automatically taking a cigarette from his breast pocket, which he dangled from his lips without lighting, while outside the mansion the photographer fumbled with his camera, having no idea how quickly this photo would be seen on front pages and nightly newscasts worldwide. Blazing child behind glass, her mother and the shaman nearly naked and clearly visible, clearly awe-struck in the upper left-hand corner. And in that last instant before the shaman would shake off paralysis and leap from the balcony balcony, cover the child's body with his own naked form, only to discover that the flames they had all seen had burnt not one hair on her head, not 1 inch of her precious flesh. The 3 spectators stood as if in a dream, mesmerized by the apparition before them, while Calliope Bird-Morath raged brighter and brighter, burning with the glory of her furious apotheosis. Thank you very much.